Thank you for listening to Torah Media Atlanta. Won't you consider making a donation to help support this important work? Just go to TorahMediaAtlanta.com and click on the donate link. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening. Welcome back to all. We missed you all last week as we trekked out here to the Dome. Those of you who were privy to the online stream were privy to technology at its best. Those of you who had a hard time accessing, that's all right. I plan on repeating at least most of what we spoke about last week, but then forging onwards. I'm sorry. Joel, as soon as the class was over, Joel shot me an email and said, "Thanks so much." So I said, at least I know somebody out there was listening.
Rabbi Friedman, number one at work, said that he looked at the screen and saw himself and he was saying basically he was self-conscious talking to a screen and not getting feedback from people.
Yeah, I had a very hard time. I think I mentioned it during the class. I had a very hard time. There's nobody in the room. Just talking to a computer. There's no feedback. There's no response. You have no idea who's out there. I had to give a phone Musar class last week, and again because of the snow. So somebody said, "Why don't we do it over the phone?" I said, "Great." So we had about 18 people online or on the phone, and there I was just talking to the wall, literally.
You didn't get interrupted, so you were able to go through stuff like that.
I really did a lot. That is true. But I didn't accomplish the point of this class. The point of this class is not to teach. The point of it is to be able to interact with all of you. So I'm glad.
65 on the highway last week. We got ahead.
Okay, so we're going to really...
When you did it on the computer without interruptions,
we're actually in chapter 10. We're in chapter 10. Yeah, good point. We are in chapter 10. But for all of you who were not with us last week, we'll go back to chapter 1. Okay, let's quickly review what we spoke about up until now, what we spoke about last week, and let's try to get to the point of this evening. So we're at Light and Darkness, just in case you've forgotten where we're up to. By the way, next week, Rabbi Friedman will be in Israel on the Kollel's Israel trip, and therefore there will be no first class next week. Don't know if he mentioned that, but I will mention that to you. So therefore, my class will still be at 8 o'clock. So if you'd like to show up at 7, that's your choice. If you'd like to prepare for an hour, that's great. I'm all for it. But if you're waiting for a class, don't be surprised if there is no class till 8.
Okay, I just want to tell you now.
Yes.
I'm not going to be here next week, but it has nothing to do with the other Rabbi Friedman not being here. I'm going to be here.
That's fine. I hope that
I will
this will be here and it will be online.
Can you move your class up to 7?
Can I? If it's more convenient for everyone, then I will do that. I'd like to be home for my wife, but I think my wife will understand. If by show of hands, who finds 7 o'clock better? You can come, but if it's at 8, you can't. Okay?
I'm out of time.
I'm good for 7.
You're going to 7 next week. Do you want to class at 7 or 8?
Only one class at 8.
We're going to one class.
I'm feeling that 9 works for everyone.
7. He wants to know if you will be class 7:30.
7 or 8, 7 or 8?
7. I'm in Florida.
Do I hear 6? Here we go.
7:30?
7:30. So I guess most people wait in at 7. I'm sorry. But it will be recorded, so just in case you're out of town or you cannot make it, you will be able to access it. Okay, light from darkness. Let's take a look at the verse. Again, we're going to jump into Rashi and hopefully discuss something that I believe is a very important lesson and a very profound thought. Verse 4, Vayar Elokim. We're on page 4, verse 4. Vayar Elokim Asa'or Kitov. God saw the light was good. Vayavdel Elokim. God separated Bein Ha'or Ubein HaChoshech. He divided between the light and the darkness. And let's jump into verse 5, just for kicks. Verse 5, Vayikra Elokim Lo Aryom. He called light day. V'lachoshech Kara Loila. And to darkness he called night. Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker Yom Echad. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just completed the first day. Okay, now let's go back first. And God divided between the Or and the Choshech, the light and the darkness. So Rashi tells us that what does this mean, to divide between the light and the darkness? The question that we spoke about earlier was, if God saw that the light was good, then why do anything with it? There's really nothing to do to something that is good. And Rashi is troubled with that as well. What does it mean that he saw the light was good and therefore he divided it? Says Rashi, here too the Agadaic explanation is necessary, and he quotes a Midrashic explanation that he saw that it was not fitting that the wicked should have the use of it, the light. He therefore set it apart for the righteous in the world to come. That is Rashi's first explanation based on the Midrash. But in other words, the word Vayavdel, as we pointed out, can mean one of two things. Vayavdel can mean to divide, to separate two components from one mass, or it can mean to set apart for someone, or for something, or for a later time, but to put it aside, as it were. And therefore Rashi, looking at this word Vayavdel, realizes that two explanations could actually be contained in that one word. The first explanation that he explains is based on the definition of the word Vayavdel, meaning setting apart. That he took this light, this spiritual light, and he set it apart for the righteous of the future world, the world to come. But then Rashi continues and gives another explanation. According to its simple meaning without any midrashic explanation, what does the word Vayavdel simply mean? It means to divide. He saw that it was good, and that it is therefore improper that it, the light and darkness, should function together in confusion. So he established that one be bounded by the day, and the other be bounded by the night. So in other words, to have light and darkness functioning together at the very same time is, as Rashi explains, is improper. Ve'ein noeh in the Hebrew. It is not good. It's not fitting for the supernal light, this spiritual light, and for Choshech to operate at the same time. So therefore he divided each one, and he allocated light for day, darkness for night. So we have a division, we have a neat category, each one is allocated to its own domain, and they don't mix into one another. Now, last week we discussed the following point, and that is that prior to this division, which we are reading about here, light and darkness did function together. Now, we may have a hard time conceptualizing that, because in our book, if you add a little bit of light to a lot of bit of darkness, you have light. A little bit of light in a lot of darkness creates light. So, to us, it doesn't seem possible for them to function together. It just doesn't make any sense. And yet, we have an example of this, and I am going to bring you some Martin, please follow along.
What are we talking about? Physical light, or are we talking about spiritual light?
Yes. He's talking about.
Last week when you were watching, did you get I kept getting these stoppages on my computer, little stall.
A little bit. Not, it may have been on his side, especially we both sort of at the same time. So a little bit. It was running more smoothly. In the beginning, I thought it would be better.
In the beginning then it started
I think it's a cash issue.
Then I think I can just crashed.
Yeah.
So I just go.
Thank you.
Okay, turn your Chumashim to page 345. Should sound familiar. We just read this parsha a few weeks ago. And in Parshas Bo, we have a discussion of the last of the three plagues, specifically here, the ninth plague, darkness. Verse 21 at the top. Hashem said to Moshe, stretch forth your hand towards the heavens, and there shall be darkness upon the land of Egypt, and the darkness will be tangible. Moshe stretched forth his hand towards the heavens, and there was thick darkness throughout the land of Egypt for a 3-day period. No man could see his brother, nor could anyone rise from his place for a 3-day period. But for all the children of Israel, there was light in their dwellings. So we have a description over here of darkness. Darkness, very unfamiliar darkness, because darkness to us is simply the lack of ability to see. And yet over here there seems to be more than just a lack of light. There seems to be more of a physical, debilitating substance that was preventing the Egyptians from, number one, being able to see, but number two, even being able to move. And yet, the very last verse, when describing what was happening to the Egyptians, there is a description of what was happening for the Jewish people. And for the Jewish people, there was light in their dwellings. Now, interestingly enough, we have in a number of verses later, in chapter 11, verse 2, which is the next page, we have a description of God commanding Moshe to tell the people, in verse 2, the third line from the top, please speak in the ears of the people, let each man request of his fellow, and each woman from her fellow, silver vessels and gold vessels. And Hashem granted the people favor in the eyes of Egypt, and so it happened. Now, interesting that the Medrash tells us that when the Jewish people actually sought these vessels, these items of clothing from the Egyptians were very quick to deny that they owned anything of value, and therefore there's really nothing that we can give you. So, thanks but no thanks. And the Jews said, actually, I was in your house last week. And in fact, I actually rummaged through the drawers, and I noticed that you have an heirloom, whatever it is, and I kind of like that. So if you can just, right there, that one. No, the one under it. Yeah, right there. If you could just take that out and pass it up, please, that'd be great. Now these Egyptians are staring at the Jews, trying to figure out, how in the world do you know what we have? And the Jews responded, because during that plague of darkness for those 3 days, while you were debilitated and you couldn't see what was going on, we actually entered your house and we had bright daylight. And we could see anything that we wanted, and we could move about throughout your house, and we could find anything that we wanted. We weren't allowed to take it, but we know exactly what's there. So now that we're allowed to take it, and not only are we allowed to, but actually God has requested of us to take it, we would like it. So you can't deny what you have, because we know exactly what you have.
Doesn't that make you feel like
I'm sure the Egyptians were a bit disturbed, to say the least. Additionally, the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, was one of the first mitzvahs that the Jewish people was commanded to do. Interestingly enough, the lamb was the god of Egypt. Now, if the god that you worship is now being roasted and eaten by the local population, and indeed the population that was under your servitude, yes, that I would imagine that is a bit disturbing. That is true. Yes, obnoxious may be a good word.
What about the smell?
The smell too.
But yeah, obnoxious, but the thing is, there seems to be an odd mechanism going on here. It's like the Jews go into the house, they look around, they don't take it when they could, which you could argue would have been theft at that point, but they get the goods, and then they make a request later. Excuse me, the second thing underneath, I know where it is, I mean, there's got to be a reason why that's laid out that way. It's not
Sure. I can definitely see the Egyptians being in a total state of shock.
You mean just blow their minds?
Well, I mean, as though the other plagues didn't.
What were they to do with these things when they gathered?
They were going to use them later.
Wear them, sell
In
them.
the desert to build a tabernacle.
Yeah.
They used to go to
There you go. Take money. But before we drift far afield, let's realize what's happening over here. We have a makkah, we have a plague of darkness over here. And the way the Torah is describing the plague of darkness is that darkness pervades the entire territory that's occupied by the Egyptians, and yet in the very same place and time, the Jewish people have light. Now, that sounds vaguely familiar, that light and darkness are operating together. Now, it's not what we thought it was, but now we're getting a slight indication of perhaps what is meant when we speak about light and darkness functioning together. Not like a cholent, a mixture where it's just haphazard, but that one does not necessarily preclude the other. That they both could operate at the very same time, but for this person it's one result, and for another person it's a totally different result. And that they could both operate in the very same environment. Yes?
Okay, so anyway, in the Chumash it says that they had light in their dwellings. So does the dwellings mean in their homes, or does the dwellings mean in the area where they live?
That's it. What's the difference?
Well, if it's in their homes, then it's isolated and away from the Egyptians. But if it's in the area where they're living, it kind of fuses out into parts of the places where the Egyptians were living.
It's true. It's a great question. So simply I would tell you that it was in their area. They lived in a separate, segregated area called Goshen, and that's where they had light while the Egyptians had darkness. The real trouble is that when we're told by this medrash that the people would walk into the homes, they are actually walking right past an Egyptian who's frozen in place because he or she simply can't move because whatever it is just debilitating, and they're just walking right past them. So they see the Egyptians, and the Egyptians can't see them. So, wow. What a situation. It sounds strange, but it sounds as though this is a throwback to a period of time before this very verse that we're studying. Before God separates the light from the darkness, the light and the darkness function together. We have a hard time understanding that, but at least here we have one expression of it functioning together. At the very same place, the very same time, both of them are operated. Okay? Point number one. Point number two. The Talmud tells us something very interesting about the future world. The world of the future, when the world achieves its destiny, in the words of the Talmud, it will happen after 6,000 years, and that's not according to the 2011 calculation, that's according to the 5771 calculation. So it gives us a little hope that we're right around the corner from the end of time. And the end of time, from a Jewish perspective, is actually a good thing. So we're heading towards our destination. So what will happen when we finally get there? Lots of stuff.
Isn't it the end of time as we know it, not necessarily the end of time?
That's correct. The end of time, the way others want to view it, is the end of existence. The end of time, the way we understand it, is the end of reality as we know it, and clearly the rules will change because the reality will change because God will reveal himself, and once he reveals himself, then most of the stuff that we're struggling with is going to be forever moot. So says the Gemara, something very interesting. The Talmud says that Rav Shimon ben Lakish, one of the scholars, the sages of the Talmud, states the following: Ein Gehenim la'olam haba. There is no hell in the world to come. Okay? Sounds like we have hope. What does that mean? Ella, rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu motzi chama meinartika. God will remove the sun from its protective coating. Is it physical? Is it spiritual? I have no idea. But somehow or another, there is something around the sun that is preventing the full force of the sun to be exposed to us people on earth. And in the future, God will remove the sun from its sheath, from its container, and tzadikim misrap inba, and through the light of the sun, the righteous will be healed by the light of the sun, u'rishoim ni doninba, and the evil people will be judged by the light of the sun. And the way the verses describe it, it sounds like walking into a tanning salon and some people coming out with a great tan and other people coming out shriveled and burnt. And that's exactly what's happening. It's the same source, it's the same light from the sun, but for those that deserve it, it serves as a healing force. And for those that don't, it serves as a destructive force. Again, if we think about it conceptually, we have the very same experience taking place over here. We have one source, we have one light, and for some, it's one thing, and for others, it's something altogether different. Okay? So these makos, these plagues in the middle of our experience in Egypt, seem to be a throwback to something that took place before time, and also a harbinger, a portent for what is to come at the end of time. But somehow, this little portion of time in the middle of everything seems to be a time warp, because it does not make any sense in the world that you and I know of to have one thing which is both good and bad depending on who is receiving it. It's either good or it's bad. It's either good or evil. We have a segregation. We have a division between the two. And therefore, if one is, God forbid, exposed to evil, the only way to hide, to shield oneself, is to remove oneself from that environment. Because you can't just stand there and expect that negative force to somehow be positive to you where it's negative for everyone around you. It doesn't make any sense. That's not the way that the world that we live in works. Which is actually very interesting, because if we take a look at the 10th plague, the plague of Makas Bechoros, if you turn to page chapter 12, verse 13, 353, thank you. We find something very interesting. We find that from plague 9, from the 9th plague of darkness to the 10th plague of the plague of the firstborn, we find a transitional element. All of a sudden here, God says that, in verse 12, I shall go through the land of Egypt on this night, and I shall strike every firstborn in the land of Egypt from man to beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I shall mete out punishment, I am Hashem. Verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you upon the houses where you are. I shall see the blood, and I shall pass over you. There shall not be a plague of destruction upon you when I strike in the land of Egypt. This is very different than the plague of darkness, where at the very same time that it was dark for one, it was light for another. Here we're told that the only way to avoid the plague is if you run indoors and distinguish yourselves as trying to be protecting of that negative force that's out there. That's a very different experience that the Jewish people are now experiencing. They are now being told that now you're being introduced to the real world, where when there's evil outside, you must go indoors. Do not expect yourselves to be saved like the previous Makkah, the previous plague, where all the while that the Egyptians are suffering, you can actually live in the very same environment and benefit while they are being destroyed. We have another similar case to this. Similar story. We have Sodom, the infamous city of Sodom. And we have an individual in Sodom by the name of Lot. And this fellow Lot is Avram's nephew. And Avram wages war to be able to save this nephew of his, Lot. And the sages tell us that this nephew Lot was a very special person, not necessarily on his own, because clearly he's quite an ambivalent figure. If you take a look at the verses, you find that he's kind of swinging back and forth, not really sure where he's at. But clearly he had some merit, because from him comes Ammon and Moab, two nations. From Moab comes Ruth, and from Ruth comes David. And from David comes Mashiach. So something's up with this guy. He's clearly not just another Joe. So he's trying to save Lot. And not only is he trying to save Lot, but actually he's trying to save the entire Sodom. And this exchange with God is a very interesting exchange, not for now, but basically he is negotiating. He's negotiating to save the city of Sodom. Back, forth, back, forth. What's the end result? Does he succeed or not? So what would all of you say? Not. What happened to Sodom?
You got like stoned.
It got stoned, right? Literally. The sulfuric acid destroyed everything. Nothing remained. But in truth, that's not correct. Because whereas the entire city of Sodom was destroyed, God pulls out one individual. And his name was Lot.
His wife got out too.
That's true.
Turned around and looked.
Barely. Right. You also took a tour with that tour guide that told you about that pillar of salt? No.
Didn't his kids get out too?
The what? His daughters, correct. So clearly Lot and whoever of his family merited it were saved. But were they saved while Sodom was being destroyed? Were they able to remain in the city while Sodom was being destroyed? No. They had to be yanked out, plucked out. Then Sodom was destroyed, and we have individuals that are set apart and saved. So evil and good weren't coexisting. It was evil that was happening, whereas the good was pulled out in order to save it. So that is a this-worldly experience, where just like the plague of the firstborn, where in order to spare yourself, you need to remove yourself, you need to distinguish yourself, you need to isolate yourself, to preserve yourself, in a pre-time or post-time world, everything is fused together. There is no need for segregation in order to be able to survive.
So in this case...
Which case?
When they were secluding themselves in their houses, they, at this point,
Bless you.
to them that they have to take an active part in this.
That's correct.
Not just all Hashem, you have to be...
That's exactly it. And in fact, the mitzvah observance that they are being introduced to is the very beginning of understanding what the Jewish people's mission in this world is, to recognize that there are going to be two forces in this world. And they need to be very cognizant of that fact. And they can't just sit around and just assume that they're special, and therefore, I know that everything around me is corrupt and evil, but I'll be saved. No, you won't. In fact, you'll be dragged into it just like Lot was dragged into the evil of Sodom. Bless you. So you need to do your part, exactly. You need to do your part. You need to distinguish yourselves. You need to separate yourselves from that evil in order for you to create a womb of goodness, as it were, in order to create a force field, a protective barrier to prevent that evil from influencing.
Where is the blood coming from that they're supposed to be?
From the Paschal lamb.
Right.
Oh, they've already been there.
Again, maybe I'm pulling from some Pagata someplace, but wasn't also the purpose of the marking is simply so the Egyptians would see the force of God and see those being saved where they were not?
Clearly, every one of the plagues, the Egyptians saw that the plague only was brought onto the Egyptians, and the Jewish people did not experience it. Starting from blood in the very beginning, of course, we know that if the Egyptians wanted to drink water, they had to turn to the Jews, who were the water sellers, because the only water that was to be gotten was from the Jews. Every one of the plagues allowed there to be a very clear recognition that God can do something for one and nothing for another. So this was just in a succession. This was yet another example of that. Okay, now if we think about that, if we think about the Makas Choshech, the plague of darkness, and we think about the notion of pre-separation and the end of time, all of these are moments where light and darkness, evil and good, as it were, are functioning together at the very same time. That is nothing like the world that we live in. And therefore, every other situation, other than that little blip in the middle of history, which is really a throwback to creation, because every one of the plagues was delivered in order to indicate to the Egyptians and to the Jews that I am the God that created the world. I know none of you were around at creation, and I don't expect you to know that I am the God that created the world. But you Jewish people were in Egypt, and you left Egypt. And in fact, it's very interesting that this coming week's parasha, we have God introducing himself to the Jewish people. The very first of the 10 Commandments is, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of Egypt. Now that's a pretty lame way of introducing himself. He could have had a name tag that said, hi, my name is God. I created every atom in this existence. That means every atom in you, in him, in her, everything that you see is me. I created it all. To me, that's a much more impressive statement than I'm the God that... Remember that one place in history we were stuck for a couple of years and I took you out? That's me. Oh. There you go. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in his classic work of philosophy, the Kuzari, writes that the reason why God introduced himself using those terms was because the Jewish people could relate to that. Because, that just happened. We were there. We know exactly what you're talking about, God. And not only were we there, and not only did we experience the exodus from Egypt, but we actually experienced the realization and the full deep recognition that you, God, must have created the world. Because he who creates can manipulate. And every element of creation was manipulated. Starting from the seas, the sky, the land, every element of creation was. So, Jews, you know who I am. I'm the one that created the world. You weren't around, but you sure were around now. And now you know that then I created everything that exists. So this moment in time is literally a throwback to creation. It's a time warp. Yes. What's bothering you?
Nothing. Two things.
Two things.
Why? This is stupid. But, why
I hate when people introduce terms.
I can't quite bring it out. God gave them these commandments on a rock, okay?
On a rock?
On the tablets.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Not prudential.
Are you stoned?
Yeah, he is.
Stoned.
Yeah. Why could he not simply have said, I mean, I don't know exactly how to ask you this or how I'm trying to phrase it, but, we're saying that he had to do this and had to say,
Had to do what?
I am the God who brought you out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Why couldn't that just be in parchment that we learned that? We didn't see that. We weren't in Egypt.
Good.
And so we're accepting that simply because of the written.
That's a great question. Not for now, but one day we'll talk about that. It's a great question. It's such a basic question, right? So I'm not going to discuss it now, but the basic answer is we have a Masorah. A Masorah means a tradition, a continuous tradition. So that's clearly going to be the basis of our belief system. Otherwise, you're right. If it's based on a printed work, we're in real trouble. But let's end the conversation right now. But thank you. Good question. Yes.
The first statement that God made was, I am your God. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt.
Right.
It was in Bereishis, in the beginning, God said.
It sure was. The first statement that God makes to the Jewish people, as a Jewish people, is, I am the God that took you out of Egypt.
He made it to Moshe.
He made it to the Jewish people,
Through Moshe.
not necessarily through Moshe. The entire Jewish people heard those words.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So now it's interesting that the world was created with 10 statements. And, that's interesting. 10 statements, 10 commandments. I wonder if there's a correlation. And wait, there are also 10 plagues. And the sages connect every one of those together. Not for now, but it's absolutely brilliant when we realize that it's not arbitrary. In fact, the 10 statements that God used to create the world are called ma'amaros. Ma'amaros comes from the Hebrew root amar. Amar means to say. The 10 commandments are not called asara ma'amaros. It's called aseres ha-dibros, from the word diber, which means to speak. So, to say and to speak are the same thing. Or are they? If there's a different word for it, then I guess they're different. What's the difference? And the difference between the root amar, to say, versus diber, to speak, is the difference between the 10 statements that God used to create the world, and diber, which is the 10 commandments. Essentially, one is structure, and one is content. God creates the structure of the universe in the first days of creation, but the purpose of creation is now introduced with the 10 statements that are now introduced to the Jewish people. Amar is the general subject that you're communicating. Diber is how you actually articulate it, the actual words that you use. One is the framework, the structure, and one is the content. So that's just a little teaser. Yes? What was that?
Do Abraham take anything?
Yes. Yes. Excellent.
Is there any connection in the plagues between the reason why the first commandment of Dam, first Makkah of Dam, first Makkah is Dam? I know it's a dumb question, but it's not a stupid question, it's a dumb question. But the first Makkah is Dam, and the last one has to do with Dam also. Makkah Sachoros, where you paint the wall.
The plague doesn't have to do with dam, but there's a dam component. There's a blood component.
So,
interesting. I've never thought about that. It's a fascinating point.
Well, the only connection that I see in it potentially is that they both have to do with life-giving forces, and but that's a stab in the dark hasn't worked.
Stab. Okay, but I'd like to end off this evening with the following quote, and a very profound thought, because when we're talking about light and darkness and God separating light from darkness, so it's interesting because Rashi gave two very distinct reasons what the word Vayavdel means. One of them meant to be set apart for the world to come, and one of them was to divide one from the other. So you and I would read Rashi and say, Rashi is giving two totally separate explanations. But yet, after this evening, you realize that the two explanations are actually getting very murky and merging into one. Because one of them speaks about setting apart this supernal light for the righteous in the world to come. In other words, that portent to the future where light and darkness will function together, and that light of the sun will be used to heal the righteous, but the very light of that same sun will be used to punish the evildoers. That's what it means to set it apart for the righteous in the world to come. Why the world to come? Because this world cannot contain that relationship. This world is segregated. Evil and good, light and darkness don't function together. So God sets it apart now to skip over the period of time called the world as we know it to the time after time, which is when the righteous will benefit from it. And then Rashi says, in order to separate one from the other, which is exactly the same thing. To separate one from the other so that they cannot function together in this world. So Rashi's two explanations are actually, the first is referring to the bookends, which is before time and after time, and Rashi's second explanation is referring to the meat in the middle of the sandwich. Time as we know it. That period of time between the beginning and the end, where the two function totally separately. Okay? Think about that. It's pretty deep, but it's very profound. But I share with you the following. In the world plan, separation, which is called Havdalah we mentioned in the past, like the ceremony that we have on Motzei Shabbos on Saturday night. In the world plan, separation is both stimulus and catalyst to life on earth. Listen carefully. Indeed, it is this universal polarization which gives man his earthly mission, to do everything in his power to overcome these dualisms and to bring about the supreme unity everywhere he possibly can. For everything springs from one unique source, and everything instinctively tends to return to it. In the beginning, man and woman formed just one being, but subsequently they were split into two distinct bodies. Hence, the natural tendency to form one flesh is deeply rooted in their beings. It is the same for the other separations. We mentioned in Havdalah that God separates the holy from the mundane, light from darkness, Israel, the Jewish people, from the other nations, and Shabbos from the 6 working days. All of those they are separations that God introduced into the world. They should in no way be considered as naturally occurring and as representing eternal, immutable, definitive states. The separation between light and darkness is destined to be overcome in the future when a new light will shine over Zion. So each one of these divisions that we speak about in Havdalah, between the holy and the mundane, the light from darkness, the Jewish people from the rest of the world, Shabbos, which also represents the world to come, from the 6 working days, which refer to this world, all of those are manual separations that God came in, pulled apart, so that they could function in this world as we know it, as separate, But the fact that they were created together and God separated them indicates that their natural state is to once again be together. Before creation, before this world is created, we have light and darkness functioning together. God pulls them apart. At the end of time, we have light and darkness returning together. It's in the meantime, in the world that God created, that He created separation, as He calls it, polarization, separate components. They all emanate from one God. They are all ultimately unified. But our perception, our experience of them are separated. They're separate components. It's up to us to be able to transcend what our eyes, ears, mind perceives, and to be able to see that it's just an artificial separation. Eventually there will arrive a day where those separations will once again reunite. So we function in a world today which is between the two bookends, where light and darkness don't function together, and therefore evil and good don't function together. And therefore when evil occurs, if you're there, you're affected. If you're insulated, you're isolated, you're not affected. Because that is the way evil and good function in this world. But that is an artificial state that will change, just like it was before God separated the light from the darkness, just like God will once again return the light to the darkness at the end of time.
Thank you for listening to Torah Media Atlanta. Won't you consider making a donation to help support this important work? Just go to TorahMediaAtlanta.com and click on the donate link. Thank you very much.